Civilization. It's the hallmark of humanity. The thing that makes us unique among all the species on the Earth. But why did it first arise? What pushed our ancestors to abandon their nomadic lives and build the fantastic civilizations of the ancient world? Most historians begin the story of civilization about 5,000 years ago. But to truly understand it, we're going to begin at the beginning of everything. The Big Bang, when all matter, all energy that will ever exist bursts into being in a trillionth of a second.
13.8 billion years ago, there was the mother of all explosions, the Big Bang. A tiny little singularity of space and time blew up to create the galaxies, the planets, the stars, you and me.
After the Big Bang, matter and energy spread out across the universe, where the force of gravity pulls it together into dense clumps. Intense pressure ignites fusion reactions that transform those clumps into shining stars. Then 4.5 billion years ago, our sun and the planets around it take form. This is early Earth. It's a place you would hardly recognize. You couldn't survive a moment on its 1800 degrees centigrade surface. As things cool down and oceans condense, the first bacteria, the first life, appears.
From the early stages of life, certain organisms learn to access energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis.
These bacteria begin to pump something into the atmosphere that will make human history possible on this planet. Oxygen. Then, after almost 4 billion years of life on Earth, in a sudden flurry of evolutionary change called the Cambrian explosion, life as we know it bursts into bloom.
By the Cambrian explosion of 600 million years ago, the record in the rocks of the Earth reveals a huge array of multicellular organisms. And thereafter, evolution picks up more and more quickly.
"500 million years ago, plants such as ferns and mosses begin to colonize the land. It's the first wave of vegetation that will grow to include all the crops and trees that we'll use to build our civilization. Then come animals, like amphibians. Life explodes in diversity, laying the groundwork for everything we know today. As all this is happening, the land itself is always on the move. Continents drift across the planet's surface. Eventually, they take the familiar shapes on which human history will play out. Africa and India start crashing into Eurasia. And as part of this great collision, the mountains of northern Africa and Spain, and the Alps and the Himalayas rise. Two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, begin to flow. The Persian Gulf and the Red Sea thrust far into the land. And a region we call Mesopotamia comes into being. A region that will play an outsized role in the great drama of civilization that is to come. And so the stage is set for the rise of civilization. It begins in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago, when people there figure out a new way to harvest deep time's greatest gift, the ancient energy from the Big Bang, which cooled into matter that was gathered up by gravity into our sun. There, extreme temperatures and pressures initiate nuclear reactions that release energy and radiate it to Earth as life-giving light and heat. Plants store this energy as glucose. Then herbivores access that glucose by eating plants. And the carnivores access that energy 2 steps on by eating the herbivores.
The story of the universe, the story of life, in fact, is a story of energy. Believe it or not, all the energy that we consume on the Earth today, our cereals and our bacon and eggs, originally came from the Big Bang.
As humans evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, we harvested this energy by simply hunting and gathering.
For 99% of human history, we basically lived as nomads, chasing the deer and the buffalo, getting energy from wherever we could. When the deer and the buffalo left, we had to leave too.
But about 8,000 BC, in a few select places, some people begin to experiment with a new way of harvesting energy. They're growing their own crops. An act so seemingly simple, it's hard to believe it will kickstart a revolution. But it will. These are the first seeds in the rise of civilization. And at first, it is only happening in one region on Earth, here in Mesopotamia. Why? A major reason is that the hills above Mesopotamia provide the motherlode of native plants that can be cultivated, including several species of a plant that's going to become mankind's most vital resource for all of recorded history. A plant whose roots go far back into deep time. Which plant is it? It's grass. It's not an exaggeration to say, no grass, no civilization. Around the world, every major civilization has been a collaboration between humans and a particular grass. millet in North China, rice in South China. In Mesoamerica, corn. In the Middle East, wheat and barley. You don't get civilization without grass. For most of deep time, grass didn't exist. It first arises about 100 million years ago, when certain plants evolved to spread their pollen in a new way. Not through bees or other insects, but through the wind. But once it appeared, grass carpeted the planet.
Grass has the ability of being able to spread relatively quickly into ecologies and environments and populate them quite fully.
And here's where the forces of deep time help determine where civilization began. For one thing, the hills around Mesopotamia happen to have two kinds of wild grass that are easily cultivated and highly nutritious: wheat and barley. So early farmers here have a major advantage over people elsewhere on the planet. But they still had work to do. So over the centuries, they took an early version of local wheat and they carefully selected it for the traits they wanted. One of those traits is larger seeds. Another is what's called non-shattering seeds, so that when the wheat is harvested, the seeds don't fall off and get scattered and lost. So slowly, over time, by careful selection, humans coaxed this to evolve into this. And it wasn't just local grasses that could be tamed. Wandering the hills of Mesopotamia, our lucky farmers would have seen the ancestors of modern cattle: goats, sheep, and pigs. A collection of creatures that happen to have the right stuff to be tamed. Instead of hunting them for their meat, farmers could learn to raise them, ensuring easy, reliable access to animal protein for the first time in history. But why were these animals all found in Mesopotamia? Part of it was sheer luck. But another part was that deep time placed Mesopotamia at one of the vital crossroads of the world. As plate tectonics assembled the old world, Mesopotamia found itself in the sweet spot where Asia, Europe, and Africa came together. Any wild animal migrating in any direction was likely to come through here. And if it liked these conditions, it stuck around. But what exactly is it about this collection of animals in ancient Mesopotamia that meant they could be domesticated and help humanity launch our first civilizations? Have you ever thought about why some animals became farm animals and others didn't? The first part of the answer is that all of our farm animals are plant eaters. And this is key. It's way too expensive to keep and feed animals that eat other animals, much less one that might view you as lunch. So, if you're looking for an animal to domesticate, pick a herbivore. But just because an animal eats grass doesn't mean it can be domesticated. When was the last time you saw someone plow a field with a zebra?
Some animals are simply untamable, they're too aggressive.
What else do cows, goats, and sheep have in common? that make them tameable. They're all herd animals that will sometimes even stampede in their eagerness to follow a leader. Take that instinct, substitute yourself for the natural herd leader, and you're on your way to turning a wild beast into a very useful animal indeed. But of the hundreds of large mammal species on Earth, only 16 will submit to a human being leading the herd. And so it's truly remarkable that among the select group, 4 of the most important animals that can be domesticated happen to exist in one small region of the ancient world. So thanks to favorable wild crops and animals, it is here in Mesopotamia that humankind begins the journey to farming, which is the key to the civilizations and empires to come. But this still leaves the question, why now? If fully modern humans had been around for 100,000 years, and farming just started 10,000 years ago, what on earth were we waiting for? It turns out we were waiting for warmth. 2.6 million years ago, an era of ice ages begins, producing distinct cold eras punctuated by periods of warm interglacials. Modern humans evolved during the last glacial period. And when did it end? You guessed it, 10,000 years ago. The fact is, plants like warm weather. And it was only 10,000 years ago, when the most recent ice age ended, that conditions in Mesopotamia finally came together in just the right way.
If you want to produce grain, you need a growing season that's at least 90 days long. You need summertime temperatures in the mid-20s Celsius. You need it slightly cooler at night. And you need abundant but not excessive rainfall. It's at the point when we see the glaciers start to retreat last time, about 10,000 years ago, that we start seeing the beginnings of agriculture.
So climate change helps answer the question of why farming started when it did. Now, flash forward from 8,000 BC to 3,800 BC. People in hills above Mesopotamia have been farming for over 6,000 years. And things have been going pretty well. But a disastrous change is coming.
There was a general drying out. You didn't have as much the annual rains and floods. There were hotter temperatures overall.
A climate crisis that starts around 3,800 BC threatens to wipe out Mesopotamia's ideal conditions and bring the farming experiment to an end.
The Sahara Desert advanced into former grasslands. And what we essentially see are the early agriculturalists needing to innovate. They need to adapt.
And it turns out that ancient geology will be a key to their survival. "100 million years ago, as part of the endless process of continental drift, Africa and India began drifting north, crashing into Europe and Asia.
The collision of Africa and India with Eurasia pushed up a series of mountains known as the Alpine Belt. This includes the mountains of northern Africa and Spain, and the Alps, and the Himalayas, and the mountains of Indonesia. And we think of these as different mountain ranges, but they're all connected physically because they were caused by the crashing of Africa and India into Eurasia.
And these mountains are crucial to the rise of agriculture, because moist air passing over them is forced to rise, where it cools, condenses, and falls as snow. Then, during the hot, dry summer months, the snow slowly melts. This feeds major river systems, just when farmers need the water.
So without these tectonic collisions, without the creation of these mountain ranges, we wouldn't have these tremendous river systems that have been so vital for subsequent human history.
Here in Mesopotamia, two of these Alpine Belt rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flow down right into this region of early farming. Now, in 3800 BC, as this region dries out, these rivers allow people to create one of humanity's most important inventions, a key stepping stone to civilization. They begin to channel the rivers into a maze of canals and ditches that soak their fields throughout the summertime. Now they don't need rain, which has become erratic and unreliable. Now all they need is the river.
We can just imagine these early experiments in sort of ditch digging that must have gone on. Early on, this is done on a very small scale. And these villages are maybe 10, 20, 30 families, something like that.
People here have stumbled onto a solution that not only saves farming, but causes yields to explode. Now, thanks to irrigation, there's a major food surplus. So for the first time in history, some people do not have to spend their entire lives obtaining food. They can devote themselves to making things like sun-baked bricks and clay pots. In other words, now some people can specialize.
Very quickly, these initial professions explode. Arguably, pottery is the first sort of profession that appears because everybody needs to store their stuff. You need stuff to eat out of and drink out of and so on. All the things that these early towns need now start to appear. And suddenly you've got builders, you've got tool makers, irrigation diggers and bricklayers and so on. Early priestly sort of classes begin to appear. People with specialized leadership functions start to appear.
As this happens, another new thing appears for the first time. Here in Sumer, the village of Uruk mushrooms into a hub of thousands of people. The first city. And the more people gather together, marshalling the energy of the surrounding countryside, the more complex human society becomes. It's a phenomenon seen across all scales in the universe. The more matter and energy gathered together in one place, the more chances there are for new interactions, for new acts of creation. Whether it's dust and gas, pulled together by gravity into stars and solar systems, or elements gathered together into molecules, these hubs of complexity are what drive the universe forward and make it an interesting place to live.
The idea of hubs being regions of complexity where interesting things can happen permeates even life. Animals and plants could not have developed had it not been for a lot of stuff coming together and being present in about the same place.
In the emerging cities of Mesopotamia, complexity brings new challenges. People must find a way to prevent crime, resolve disputes, and pass laws. So in 3500 BC, the first large governments appear on Earth, a collection of city-states called Sumer, right here on the banks of the Tigris. Each city is ruled by a king and an elite of priests, scribes, and soldiers. These men establish laws, punish criminals, and provide order. This stability and structure helps civilization to grow. But these elites also tend to prey on their subjects. So now you get hierarchy. Using the same principle by which farmers herd cattle, people begin dominating other people.
We clearly see a leadership elite on the top. Below that, there will be what appears to be a military class, sort of the second tier. Then we'll see the great mass of peasant farmers, and eventually, as conflict increases, we'll see slaves.
This whole process of civilization, farming, irrigation, cities, hierarchies, begins in Sumer around 3500 BC. But it doesn't stay isolated here for long.
We know just a few centuries later, along the Great Nile Valley in North Africa, the second great civilization will appear, that of ancient Egypt. Further to the east in the Indus Valley, essentially modern Pakistan today, the third great civilization appears. Much further away, on the eastern end of Eurasia, there is another civilization. Initially along the northern river of China, the Great Yellow River, the Huanghe, another hub is appearing.
So far, all four ancient civilizations cluster in river valleys. The reason is simple. Early agriculture is just too primitive to create a food surplus on rain-watered land. Irrigation is still the only way to go. But humanity is about to break its dependence on rivers. Because around this time, people discover that some of the animals they first domesticated for food have another gift to give. The gift of power. Human beings are relatively weak. Over periods of sustained exertion, we can generate about 75 watts of power. And for thousands of years, we had to rely on our own muscles to get things done. Imagine today if every time you needed to switch on a light and keep it glowing, you had to turn a crank like this. It does the job, but it takes a lot of time and energy. Well, it turns out that human muscle is enough to farm rich river valleys that become naturally fertilized every year.
If I stay on a riverbank, which floods every year and brings new soil fertility every year, I, even as a weak, puny little human being, will be able to produce a high level of crops, a high yield on a riverbank
But rain-watered land needs something else to keep it fertile year after year. You need to dig down and turn the soil over to dredge up rich nutrients. In other words, you need to plow. And people, with their 75 watts of power, are just too weak to do that on a large scale. But around 3500 BC, people discover that they can train some of the animals they've been raising as food to pull plows and dredge up the soil's deep fertility.
You could go down 6, 8, maybe even 10 inches in some cases and access a huge amount of soil nutrition, which allowed us then to produce much greater crops and much higher yields. And we could move into areas that simply could not support agriculture when we were simply using human labor as the basis of the cultivation.
It's an energy revolution. By yoking a horse or an ox to a plow, mankind multiplies his power 4 to 8 times. Civilization is liberated from the trap of ancient river valleys and begins to spread. Now, for 1,000 years, the area around Sumer will produce a stream of new city-states, each with their own governments and elites. Then in 2350 BC, a powerful new leader appears. He sparks a revolution that will reorganize civilization, giving it the form it will take in most places right up to the 20th century. A form we call the Empire. His name is Sargon of Akkad.
The great Sargon of Akkad comes along, conquers each of these cities one by one to create a much larger socio-political military structure, the world's first true empire. And this just becomes the standard model then for the next 2-3 millennia.
Sargon's forced unification of Mesopotamia into the world's first empire is violent. But once the violence subsides, the benefits become obvious. This region was physically blessed by the forces of deep time. But the hubs of energy were scattered across the landscape. Uniting these individual cities into empires is like networking a bunch of individual computers together. It multiplies their power and increases the exchange of goods, services, information, and ideas. Huge amounts of labor can be mustered to irrigate more land. Trade can move safely across vast areas. And since petty local wars come to an end, empires bring arguably their greatest gift: peace. Not far away, on the Nile, a similar process has been taking place. As god kings, called pharaohs, extend their rule across Egypt. Egypt's system is such a success, it becomes the most stable civilization in history, lasting almost unchanged for 2,500 years. But can deep time help explain why Egypt will be so stable and unchanging? Rise up above the Great Pyramid and look around. 2,000 miles to the south, the Nile begins in the mountains of Central Africa. "300 miles to the north, it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. On either side stretch harsh deserts. All of this is a function of how Africa crashed into Europe, a process that began 100 million years ago. and a byproduct of this deep-time geology, will help Egypt's rulers keep their land united for millennia. One major reason for this has to do with travel and communication. In the ancient world, early boats can easily float down most rivers. But they're too primitive to sail back up, making most rivers a one-way street. But not so in Egypt. To the north, over the Mediterranean, cool winds blow south to replace hot air rising over the desert, creating a powerful breeze that never stops. So here, boats that float down the Nile can sail back up, pushed by the continuous breeze.
It's very easy to make the return journey and just come back down again. So trade and exchange, connections, if you like, between Upper and Lower Egypt are facilitated through geology.
Meanwhile, deserts on either side act as great walls to protect Egypt from invasion.
Here's this Nile civilization sealed off through its quirks of geology and geography, enjoying millennia of relatively uninterrupted, peaceful, successful civilization. Quite extraordinary.
In northern India, another new culture, called the Harappan civilization, begins to spread along the Indus River Valley, laying the foundations for the great civilizations of India. And finally, along the Yellow River in China, a fourth great civilization is taking shape.
The same basic pattern repeats itself in China at roughly the same time. It starts building cities, it develops agriculture along a similar pathway in terms of having large-scale irrigation networks.
But thanks to a quirk of deep time, China will forever develop as a world apart. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and North India are relatively close together. So these three civilizations are linked together in a huge cultural matrix. But deep time has separated China by 3,000 miles of Alpine Belt mountains and deserts.
Think about the journey you'd have to make to get from China through various deserts, the enormous mountain ranges, all products of the tectonic collision of India with Eurasia. You'd have to get through the highest mountains on Earth to be able to then send your caravans eventually down into the Indus Valley, let alone to Mesopotamia and Egypt.
China's isolation is illustrated by a major difference between East Asians and everyone else on Earth. And it has to do with how people write. In both the Middle East and in China, writing begins as pictographs and hieroglyphs, in which things and ideas are represented by thousands of individual characters. But Middle Eastern scribes eventually reduce writing to a mere 30 phonetic symbols, or even less, making it very simple. Phonetic alphabets are quickly copied across the Middle East and India. But thanks to their Alpine Belt isolation, the Chinese are unaware of this. So even today, throughout the Far East, people still have to memorize thousands of different characters in order to read and write.
Geographical isolation leads to the emergence of two profoundly different ideas about what writing should look like. Both equally rich, both capable of incredible expression, but both profoundly different, it appears, in purpose and in actual structure.
Despite being unaware of the other three ancient civilizations, China still exists on the same landmass as they do, so some things inevitably get through. Take a crop that is actually Chinese, the orange. The wild ancestor of all orange trees comes from South China. But it didn't stay isolated there for long.
Oranges, which start in China, end up all over Eurasia, and by the Roman times in the Mediterranean. So presumably there were trading routes, one little bit at a time. Farmers that tended to walk and hand seed over to their friends, that walked and handed seed over to their friends. And over very long periods of time, there were some exchanges between these two broad areas.
Across Eurasia, this happens again and again, with food, technologies, even ideas. Each great civilization reaps the benefits of everyone else's innovation. So for the next 3,000 years, all four great old world civilizations will march forward at roughly the same level of development. But things will play out very differently for the civilizations arising across the Atlantic Ocean in Central and South America. American civilizations that culminate with the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas independently invent agriculture, then build impressive cities and empires. They create stunning art and architecture, and invent novel forms of writing, and amazingly accurate calendars. But even still, they're cut off from major advances that sweep the old world. They don't have things like wheeled vehicles, or steel weapons, or gunpowder, and so they will lag thousands of years behind the people in Afro-Eurasia. Can the breakup of the ancient supercontinent Pangaea help explain why the old world got a jump start on the Americas? Pangaea begins to break into smaller pieces 175 million years ago. But they're all different sizes.
Big chunks break off, much smaller chunks break off. They go in different directions. Eventually we end up with what we'd call the Eurasian landmass, if you like, which is a very big chunk of continent, enormous. Once India and Africa also drive into that landmass, we've got this vast world zone that we'll call Afro-Eurasia.
At almost 33 million square miles, Afro-Eurasia dwarfs any other landmass. And humans will discover that for life in general, and civilization in particular, size has its advantages. Because it's so big, Afro-Eurasia has the most plants and animals, the most river valleys, and the largest temperate zone. Civilizations here have a lot to work with.
There was a lot of different resources potentially available within Afro-Eurasia that could then gradually spread.
Even today, 85% of the human race lives in Afro-Eurasia. This double continent also has another advantage inherited from deep time.
Most of Afro-Eurasia is spread in the east-west direction. And so crops that developed at one latitude could spread along a band that would get about the same amount of sunshine, about the same climate.
The same is true for technologies and even ideas. So every civilization in Afro-Eurasia advances at roughly the same pace. But compared to Afro-Eurasia's 33 million square miles, The second largest chunk of Pangaea, the Americas, is only about 16.4 million square miles and lacks the diversity of the Old World. As far as the grasses were concerned, the early Americans had no wheat, no barley, no rice, no millet. The only major grain in most of the Americas was corn. And they had a similar problem with major animals. There was no draft animal, nothing you could use for a plow, nothing you could use to pull a wagon. Even more challenging, the Americas are aligned north-south, not east-west. This creates radically different climate zones. Crops and even people that grow used to the climate of North Dakota probably won't do well in Panama.
Even today, if you were to take a road trip from, say, Alaska, right, to Chile, think of the range of environments and different geologies and so on you would have to pass through as you do that.
Still, as civilizations first arise in both the Old and New Worlds, the amazing thing is not how different they are, but how alike. By 500 BC, the Old World civilizations have begun to spread from their original hubs of the Middle East, India, and China. They'll eventually link together into a vast worldwide system. That system was rooted in history's greatest revolution, the invention of farming, which still underlies our civilization and our success today. In one sense, the rise of civilization began 10,000 years ago when Mesopotamia's people began farming. But in another sense, agriculture and civilization have roots going back much further. To the evolution of plants like grass, and animals like sheep, goats, and cattle. To the tumultuous sweep of climate change, the birth of rivers, the rise of mountains, the collision of continents, the formation of the solar system, the energy of the Big Bang itself. In short, the whole immense saga known as deep time. We live in a connected world, exchanging information at the speed of light across oceans and continents. Everybody knows that. What you might not realize is that long before humanity, the whole world was literally connected. The Earth never stays still. More than a dozen tectonic plates keep the surface in constant motion. $1.1 billion years ago, all the Earth's surface is connected in the supercontinent Rodinia. Over the next 10 million centuries, the planet's jigsaw pieces move apart and reform into new supercontinents. First, Pangaea. And after that breaks up, the supercontinent Pangaea. Whose destruction will give birth to the Age of Discovery. Because, some 200 million years ago, plate tectonics began to tear Pangaea apart. Over tens of millions of years, Europe breaks away from northern Africa. The eastern half of Africa is torn away to form South America. In another 250 million years, these continental jigsaw pieces will once again form a single landmass. But for now, the world is segregated into two major and very different zones. In one world zone, Afro-Eurasia, the linked continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia. 57% of the landmass of the world. With more people, more animals, and more plants than anywhere else on Earth. This is the zone where civilization first appears. In the other zone, North and South America, home to younger civilizations. In the late 15th century, at the time of Christopher Columbus, these two massive world zones exist in complete isolation from each other.
People living with no idea that each other even existed. You might as well have been living on different planets at that stage.
So deep time forces have set the stage for the voyages of discovery. Two isolated world zones, separated by vast oceans, one of which is about to be crossed. The launch pad for this crossing is the port of Palos, Spain, on August 3rd, 1492. An Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus is about to set sail. His plan? Find a new trade route to China. Columbus has no idea that because of Earth's geology and geography, his plan is going to utterly fail. Or how that epic failure will make his voyage one of the most influential expeditions in the history of humankind. But what's driving Columbus's journey into the unknown? What does he hope to get once he arrives in China? Believe it or not, an insecticide. You heard right, an insecticide. It all starts about 150 million years ago with the evolution of this plant known as Piper nigrum. It first grew in the mountains of India where there are a lot of pests. And to survive, a plant needs to defend itself. So, Piper nigrum evolved a special molecule to do just that. A combination of the common elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The molecule is called piperine. It's lethal to bugs, but it doesn't kill us. We're too big. It just gives us a bit of a spicy kick. You eat it all the time. It's better known as black pepper. And in 1492, wealthy Europeans can't get enough of the stuff.
Black pepper was the most valuable product out there.
But because of the forces of deep time, black pepper isn't easy for the European elite to get. Stand outside on a moonlit night and look up. What could the moon possibly have to do with where pepper grows? To find out, we need to turn back the clock to when there was no moon. 4.5 billion years ago. There's no moon in the sky, and the Earth is still forming. Then,
We think that an object, perhaps an asteroid roughly the size of Mars, plowed into the Earth.
The material that got splattered off Earth and the impacting object initially formed a ring or a disk around Earth, from which the moon coalesced in less than a century. The impact that led to the formation of the moon is also probably the event that caused Earth's axis to be tilted, in our case by 23.5 degrees.
And this tilt is key. It means that the midsection of the planet gets much more sustained light and heat from the sun.
The tilt of Earth's axis, this 23.5 degree tilt, is why we have tropical zones on Earth and then the temperate regions.
So after a cosmic collision creates the tropics, plants evolved to survive there. And only there in the case of spices like black pepper, which generally needs to be planted in soil with a temperature between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit.
So if you're not living in Southeast Asia and you really want pepper, you can't just produce it yourself. You have to buy it in from that area.
And because deep time has created an uneven distribution of resources, humans have to create networks of exchange to bridge the distance to get what they want. So, before Columbus, how did Europeans get their black pepper?
Let's zoom out for a bigger picture view of the world as it existed when Columbus was born. Here's India, at the southeastern end of Eurasia, the source of black pepper and other spices. Indian merchants trade these spices with merchants from this country, China. A huge land with a temperate climate, rich soil, and immense natural resources.
For most of human history, the great Chinese dynasties were the most powerful, wealthiest states on the planet.
In the early 15th century, China is rich enough to send huge trading fleets across the Indian Ocean to East Africa, under the command of the famous Admiral Zheng He. Even when political pressure ends those voyages, the Chinese continue the centuries-long tradition of the trade routes later called Silk Roads. Merchants carry precious goods, including spices, across land and sea. The spices are passed on to merchants in the Islamic countries that stretch from northern India to the Middle East, Turkey, and North Africa. Finally, merchants from the Italian city-states like Venice or Genoa acquire the spices from Turkish or Middle Eastern ports and bring them to customers in Western Europe. So that's how spices like black pepper get to medieval Europe, and why Europeans have to pay through the nose to get them.
Europe doesn't just import spices and luxury goods. It's imported most of its mathematics and technology from the East. 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe is a ragged collection of competing nation-states. Put them all together, and their population and wealth can't match China or India.
So it's a real crisis when the Silk Road is suddenly shut down and the flow of spices stops because of the Turkish Sultan Mehmet II. The Sultan has a stranglehold on trade because of geology and geography. The prehistoric collision of continents has created two arms of the Southern Ocean, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, that jut into the Middle East center. While the Mediterranean washes its northern shores, and the Black Sea stretches along Turkey's coast. So Turkey is perfectly positioned to strike at the heart of East-West commerce. By assaulting Constantinople and other Christian ports and cities in the region, the Sultan shuts the Silk Road down. Evidence of what happened still exists in a certain building in Istanbul. It has a Greek name, Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. Today it's a museum. It was originally built as a church, the most famous Christian shrine of the Byzantine Empire, when Istanbul was called Constantinople. But along with the Christian iconography, there are quotes from the Quran. That's because the church was transformed into a mosque when the Sultan captured it in 1453.
And this causes a shock wave across Western Europe because Constantinople is essentially the gateway between Europe and the Orient. It's the place where spices and other exotic luxuries from the Orient enter Europe.
But one country in Europe has already been planning to get around the Silk Road. A country that was considered insignificant even by European standards. And yet, in the early 1400s, ground zero for the age of discovery is Portugal. Instead of depending on the Silk Road, Prince Henry, later called the Navigator, wants to find a direct sea route to India. Portugal is a poor country. But if it takes over the spice trade, it'll be rich.
Let's be frank about this. The early explorers did not go into the unknown for their health. No, they did it for financial gain.
Prince Henry's plan is to do what no one has ever done. Sail around the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. But there's a geological reason that sailing around Africa won't be easy. Africa's Atlantic coastline has very few natural harbors or inlets. So when the Portuguese sail south, there aren't a lot of safe places to anchor.
So there are many, many areas where it's almost impossible to land, and where prevailing currents and wind patterns make it very dangerous to try and get in and come out again. So we imagine these expeditions slowly working further and further down, then coming back to Portugal, accumulating more and more information.
Over the decades, Prince Henry's ships do find a handful of safe harbors. They start trading in everything from ivory to slaves. But the decades pass. Henry the Navigator dies, and his successors still haven't made it around Africa. So far, the geographical barriers imposed by deep time have been too great. Then, in 1484, Christopher Columbus comes to the Portuguese with a new plan. Never mind Africa, save time and money by sailing over the Atlantic.
They assume that if you cross this ocean that we see off our western shores here, that eventually we'll simply come to East Asia.
Columbus is sure that if he sails far enough west, he'll end up in the Far East, because he's sure that the Earth is round. But, contrary to myth, Columbus isn't trying to prove that it's round. Most educated Europeans know the Earth is a sphere. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle had calculated the roundness of the Earth 2,000 years earlier. But Columbus and other Europeans have no insight into a deeper question. Why exactly is the Earth round? What's the scientific reason that planets like ours are spherical instead of some other shape? It's a question that we can answer. And there's a clue in some recent astronomical photos. Look at these two objects. One is a comet visited by a space probe in 2014. The other is Pluto. Why does the comet have an irregular shape? Well, Pluto is a sphere, like Earth.
Well, the answer is gravity is attractive. Or as we tell our students, gravity sucks.
In other words, objects in space form when gravity pulls cosmic debris together. The force of gravity always pulls towards the center of an object. And as you add mass, gravity gets stronger.
But you see, gravity sucks evenly. And that's the reason why the state of lowest energy is when gravity accumulates all this mass, smooths out all the imperfections to create a spherical star or planet. However, for very small objects like asteroids, the gravity is not strong enough to smooth it out. In fact, if a body is less than roughly 700 miles across, gravity is not sufficiently strong to create a round planet.
Which is why Columbus is right. Nevertheless, the Portuguese pass on his plan. So Columbus has to seek out fresh investors for his project, which he can do, because one of Europe's greatest weaknesses turns out to be a secret advantage.
So, remember how Europe was the squabbling collection of competing states? Well, think about it from Columbus's point of view. If the Portuguese say no, he can go to the monarchs of England, France, or Spain, and he can say to each one of them, if you back me, I will make you the richest ruler in all of Europe. And of course, eventually, the King and Queen of Spain decide to take a gamble. They give Columbus the funding for his cross-Atlantic route to China.
And on August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships set sail across the Atlantic.
Now, from a limited point of view, you have an Italian commanding a Spanish commercial venture that's trying to get an economic advantage over the Portuguese. But think about the knowledge and the technology aboard those 3 ships. Columbus has studied cartography from ancient Greece and Rome that's been preserved by Arab scholars and translated back into Latin. He's using a compass that was invented in China and transmitted to Europe over the Middle Eastern trade routes. From the perspective of deep time history, Columbus and his men represent the sum total of all the extraordinary knowledge and innovation of Afro-Eurasia. And yet, because they don't know that the surface of the planet is divided into 2 major world zones, they have no idea where they're going.
But in spite of that, because of the shape of the Earth and geological forces unleashed tens of millions of years before, these 3 ships from Afro-Eurasia find land. An island in the Bahamas that to this day has not been clearly identified. It's the 12th of October, 1492. Columbus gives thanks to God for what he thinks is a successful business trip. In fact, he's reversed the tectonic process and brought Afro-Eurasia and the Americas back together.
The world is reconnected. Humans rediscover each other, if you like, and the entire globe becomes a sort of a modern, metaphorical Pangea.
Columbus never realizes that he's reached the outskirts of a world unknown to Europeans. He thinks he's somewhere near India. And he calls the people he encounters Indians. In fact, these islanders are the Taino. And like Columbus, they came from Afro-Eurasia.
There was this land bridge during the Ice Age that allowed waves of migrants to come from Asia and populate the Americas.
Within a couple of thousand years, they'd made it right down to the southern tip of South America. With the waning of the Ice Age from about 12,000 years ago, sea levels rise dramatically, that bridge disappears, and these humans are now cut off, isolated in the Americas from Afro-Eurasia, and the memory of this connection is sort of lost. And it won't be literally until 1492 that these vast world zones will be reconnected.
The reconnection is the start of what will be called the Columbian Exchange. A vast ongoing transfer between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia of cultures, technologies, and especially living things.
The breakup of the supercontinents was not just a geologic event, it was also a biological event.
But now technologies, plants, animals, diseases, and people from one landmass or the other will spread across oceans and around the world. Phase 1 of the exchange gets underway when Columbus returns to Spain in 1493. He has found no black pepper. But there are other spices, and a strange leaf the Taíno burn that they call tobacco. This leaf will kill hundreds of millions of people. Its addictive ingredient, nicotine, evolved as a natural insecticide, like the piperine molecule of black pepper. Even more exciting for the Spanish, small amounts of gold from streams and riverbeds. They hope to find a lot more, and they expect the Taíno to get it for them. As Columbus writes in an official report, the people would make good servants, and he brings back several of them as slaves. Phase 2 of the Columbian Exchange begins on January 2nd, 1494. Columbus returns to the Americas with 17 ships, European livestock like pigs and cattle, and a small army. The bloody conquest of the Americas is about to begin. And the conqueror's most terrifying weapon is the horse.
Imagine these early horses being brought over. Imagine Native American peoples who've never seen this before, saying, wow, look at that.
But this is another story with a deep time twist, because horses aren't really an invasive species in America. In fact, they're completing a 7,000-year round trip.
The horse, which has proven so important for human history, originally evolved in the Americas.
Evolved and then disappeared, possibly hunted to extinction by the Taínos' Ice Age ancestors. But some horses escaped to safety over the bridge to Eurasia before the seas rose again. Those prehistoric horses spread throughout Asia and Europe, where they were domesticated, bred, and crossbred. Now, in 1494, the horse returns to the Americas as a weapon of conquest. Horses carry the Spanish who follow in Columbus's path into Central and South America, where they find a new world of powerful civilizations. This is Mexico City, the world's 12th largest city and the largest Spanish-speaking metropolis on Earth. It's a hub of commerce and culture. But in the middle of the city is what remains of a great temple. Mexico City is built directly over the ruins of another great city, Tenochtitlan, the urban center of the Aztec Empire in the early 1500s, 5 square miles, with a population of 200,000, 4 times that of London at the time. And it's not just the Aztecs. The Americas are home to other powerful empires and kingdoms, including the Maya and the Incas. And the Spanish conquistadors don't have an easy time bringing them down. At least, not at first. Case in point, one summer night in 1520. Hernan Cortés and his men find themselves hunted and outnumbered. Chased into the side streets of Tenochtitlan, where the spaces are too narrow to make use of their horses. Even the superior technology of guns is of little use against an endless rain of arrows and spears. But as the Spanish flee with as much gold as they can carry, they leave behind, without knowing it, a weapon more powerful than gunpowder, horses, or steel. Because inside one of Cortez's fallen is a biological time bomb, brought forth from deep time. And months later, when the Spanish and some anti-Aztec allies return to Tenochtitlan, they find the city in disarray and the streets littered with the dead. Smallpox is the beginning of the end of the Aztec Empire. The disease spreads throughout Central and South America.
The result is often catastrophic.
But why are the European diseases like smallpox and measles so instantly deadly to the peoples of 16th century America? In a way, it goes back to the horse. Horses and other large mammals were never domesticated in North or South America, because by the time the descendants of Asian hunters settled down and developed civilization in the Americas, most large mammals had died out. But look at this farm on the other side of the Pacific. For thousands of years, people all over Afro-Eurasia lived with their domesticated animals. Animals that often carried pathogens inside them. Over tens of centuries, these diseases kill hundreds of millions. But over the centuries, Afro-Eurasians developed some limited immunity. For the people of the Americas, immunity consists of 2 oceans.
Early migrants to the Americas found themselves then sealed off in this huge world zone, and the diseases of Afro-Eurasia were in no way able to make their way into the Americas.
But when people cross the water, so do their pathogens. In just over a century after Columbus, between 50 and 95% of the America's native population dies. Some groups have descendants in the 21st century. Others die out completely.
Remember, European states that are tiny in comparison to these great imperial states of the Aztecs and the Inca. But because the Europeans have got guns and they've got steel and they've got diseases, they're quickly able to conquer these very impressive civilizations and the cultures of North America as well, and turn these into great sort of areas of resource acquisition for Europe. Resources that Europe will then use to finance its conquest of the rest of the world.
Over the next 400 years, the Americas are utterly transformed by new invasive species from Europe and Asia. From cattle and pigs to rats and earthworms. From apples and oranges and Midwest wheat to the bluegrass of Kentucky.
But there was a similar trade the other way, from the Americas to Western Europe. And so what we see is a huge export of crops and livestock from all corners of the world to all corners of the world, thus radically transforming the ecology of the entire planet.
That's because, although the people of the Americas lacked large domestic animals, they had bred more than half of all humanity's usable plants, including tomatoes, squash, beans, peppers, chocolate, yams, avocados, peanuts, the potato, and a weed that became one of the world's most astonishing examples of genetic modification.
What was growing successfully in the wild in the Americas was a plant called teosinte, a small, weedy sort of grass that took many, many hundreds of generations of careful sort of selective breeding of teosinte before you could start to turn it into a crop that could feed large numbers of people. You had to sort of essentially change the DNA of this thing so that it would produce a lot larger heads.
One ear of teosinte is about the size of a finger, with 5 to 12 really hard kernels. It's not much to look at, but 10,000 years ago, farmers in Mexico began planting and breeding it. They saw that some teosinte ears were a little bigger, some kernels might be slightly softer, and they planted those. And over thousands of years of selective breeding, the farmers of Mexico created, and that's the word, they created what we recognize as modern corn. Corn is a human invention.
Initially, it probably gets imported into Europe as a novelty item, but quickly people realize that this is a really useful crop.
It turns out that while the Earth only has a few places that can grow spices, it has many areas where corn can grow. Places too dry for rice, too wet for wheat.
It grows well in a wide range of conditions, it's relatively pest tolerant, it's relatively drought resistant, and it produces a large amount of carbohydrate. And so it quickly spreads across Europe and into Africa, and today is the basis of both Europe's and Africa's food system. In the modern day, this has revolutionized agriculture across the world, and especially in places like the American Midwest or in China, where almost all of the corn that is being produced today ends up going into the belly of an animal that we then use for something else, largely for protein.
While corn is a New World crop that helps transform the Old World, an Old World crop turns out to be the foundation of an empire in the New World.
When the conquistadors first arrived in the Americas, they realized they're in a very conducive environment for growing certain crop species for which there is an enormous demand back in Eurasia, right? Chief amongst these was sugar. Sugar was the preferred drug of many, many Europeans.
Humans have a fundamental deep-time link with sugar, because it's how we use the power of the sun. Through photosynthesis, plant cells use water and carbon dioxide to turn solar energy into oxygen and sugar molecules. Simple sugar molecules are the basis for glucose, which provides energy for living cells. So we've evolved a sweet tooth, chemical receptors that make us want this energy source that we need.
An early Homo sapien that had a strong motivation for sugar might have been healthier, might have been fatter, might have survived the winter better and gone on to have more children. And over time, this sort of evolutionary process would have bred a craving for sugar in us that we have still today.
Sugar plantations spring up in areas where there's no gold to steal, parts of Brazil, the islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and elsewhere. Through exploration and conquest, Europeans have now seized something that the deep time history of the planet failed to give them: their own tropics. At first, these tropical plantations are worked by enslaved local peoples. But as we've seen, they start dying out from European diseases. So the sugar growers solve their labor shortage by importing slaves from Africa. Prince Henry the Navigator had started the slave trade between Africa and Europe in the 1440s. Now it becomes one of the biggest businesses of the entire Columbian exchange. Over the next 350 years, more than 10 million Africans will be shipped to the New World to work the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. And then other plantations growing tobacco, rice, coffee, and cotton to supply the world. If this looks like the beginning of globalization, that's because it is. But the substance that really connects the globe, linking countries around the world in a network of trade, isn't a tropical plant, but a precious metal. Buried deep inside this extinct volcano in Bolivia, known as Potosi. It's not gold, as you might think, but silver.
One of the great discoveries that the conquistadors, the Europeans, make is the availability of a huge mine of silver at Potosi. The Europeans are very quick to exploit it.
But from the view of deep time history, the silver didn't really come from Potosi, but from the death of an alien star. Stars make elements, the basic substances of the universe. When nuclear fusion at a star's core rearranges atomic nuclei with unimaginable pressure and heat. Middle-sized stars, like our Sun, make very simple elements, like helium. Larger stars make heavier elements, and if they die, they make more. When a star about 10 times more massive than our Sun uses up its nuclear fuel, it collapses, and then it blows up in an explosion 100 million times brighter than the Sun, creating even more elements and shooting them out into space. If the star is massive enough, one of those elements is silver. More than 4.5 billion years ago, gravity pulls the silver debris together into the forming Earth.
But you have chemicals which touch other chemicals and coalesce in different ways. And so as a consequence, silver was not distributed evenly across the planet Earth.
Inside the Earth, the silver from space is melted and then concentrated in areas of extreme subsurface heat. In other words, where there's volcanic activity. So millions of years ago in Bolivia, the Earth cracks open and Potosi fills with a metal that in the 16th century, the Spanish will do almost anything to get.
When silver was discovered in the New World, that gave incentive for the conquistadors to complete the process of conquering the New World. So, believe it or not, events that took place maybe 5-6 billion years ago affected the history of the Americas billions of years later.
Gold stolen from the Aztecs and Incas has been a huge windfall for the Spanish. But it's silver from Potosi that creates the first true international economy. That's because between the 1550s and 1800s, 85% of all the silver in the world from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia, flows from this one mountain. And most of it flows to one country, China. That's right, China. A few years after Columbus landed in the Bahamas, our old friends the Portuguese finally made it around Africa, to India and then China. Once Portugal opened the door, other European countries quickly found their own ways into the Chinese markets. Spain established trade routes from their new territories in the Americas. And by the late 16th century, they're buying Chinese goods with the first global currency. The purest silver coins in the world, silver from Potosi, shipped to the mint in Mexico to create the silver dollar.
Silver is then turned into coins or ingots. This is then shipped on Spanish galleons across the Pacific to the new Spanish colony in Manila in the Philippines. From there it goes on to China to pay for the still highly in-demand Chinese luxury goods. So this extraordinary creation of a supernova becomes the key medium of exchange during this early modern period, this age of discovery, and really marks the beginning of genuine commercial globalization of the planet.
500 years later, a lot of Potosi's silver has run out, and the Mexican dollar is no longer a world currency. But the effects of the global economy and the Columbian exchange are all around us. Take a look at this very common modern meal. You could call it the Old World, New World combo. Look at the burger, Old World. The cow was domesticated in the Near East, then went to Western Europe and was taken to the Americas. The wheat in the bun? That was first grown in Mesopotamia. Lettuce, Egypt. The onion is Asian. But the tomato on the burger and in the ketchup comes from Mexico. And these French fries, New World potatoes named for an Old World country. The soda has sugar, which was originally from Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific. It spread through India to the Middle East, where Europeans acquired it and cultivated it in the New World. Oh. And here are packets of salt and black pepper. The precious exotic spice from the East that jump-started the Age of Discovery. It comes free with your meal.
So today we produce black pepper on very large plantations at an industrial scale. And the costs of producing the black pepper are very, very small. And the costs of shipping this product on large container vessels is totally insignificant.
More inexpensive food for more people? That's one of the legacies of the Age of Discovery. Other parts of that legacy are very dark indeed. Violence, racism, slavery, even genocide. But there's something else to be said for the Age of Discovery. It altered forever the way we understood our place in the universe.
There's a very clear link between the discoveries of these different regions, extraordinary landforms, lifeways and so on, and what becomes the great scientific revolution, very much driven by trying to make sense of these extraordinary discoveries.
Plunder and financial gain. That's why the early explorers risked their life to go to the New World. But eventually, a transformation took place. More and more adventurers and people who are just curious began to embark upon these great adventures, the most famous of them being Charles Darwin. He was curious. He was a naturalist. He wanted to write the history of life on the planet Earth. And the only way you could do that was to get on one of these boats and sail the ocean blue. And so we begin to realize that even though originally the spirit of exploration was the spirit of looking for profit and commercial gain, eventually people went because they were curious about the world. It was the age of discovery in the truest sense of the word.
In one sense, the Age of Discovery began with a few ships in the 15th century, setting out for unknown shores. But in another sense, the Age of Discovery has roots in the very depths of time. In a land bridge that populated 2 continents, tectonic plates that ripped South America from Africa and created two huge world zones. In the molecules that formed after the collision that made the moon, and the globe-connecting element forged in the heat of a dying star. Links in the chain of events of deep time history.
Imagine what it was like when people were working here. In steel mills like this, metal was turned into tools, building materials, even deadly weapons. This place was part of the Industrial Revolution. It was an age of transformation, with men like Henry Ford, who changed the way people worked and lived. You might think the Industrial Revolution is over, but as you'll see, it's a story that's still going on. Because the Industrial Revolution is the story of energy, where to get it and how to use it. To really understand that, we have to go back, not only in time, but in space, by following that light back to its source.
The Industrial Revolution really starts here, in the roaring heart of the sun. That heart is a fusion reactor about 100,000 miles across. Here, as hydrogen is transformed into helium, trillions of packets of electromagnetic energy called photons are created and released. The photons shoot outward from the solar core, but run into an obstacle course of electrons and ionized atoms. 400,000 miles of them. Getting through this logjam of charged particles takes about 100,000 years. But when the photons finally escape the sun, they then travel through space at the speed of light, covering the 93 million miles to the Earth in 8 minutes and 20 seconds. About 390 million years ago, the photons from space interact with something new on Earth. Plants. Living organisms containing a special molecule that first evolved in ocean-dwelling algae. It's called chlorophyll.
These photons hit chlorophyll. Chlorophyll takes carbon dioxide and uses the energy of light and creates, as a waste product, oxygen. And in the process, creates organic chemicals that have energy stored in them.
This, of course, is photosynthesis. For millions of years, it powers the trees of the world's first forest. These early trees have thin bark and shallow roots. Over the years, they fall, pile up, and decay. Then, around 250 million years ago, tectonic plates that are always on the move lift and fold the land. The remains of the world's first forest are buried deep in the earth. Tectonic plates shift 4 million square miles of landmass more than 3,000 miles north, forming the continent of Europe. As glaciers advance and retreat, seas fall and rise. By 7000 BC, what was once the northern coast of Europe is cut off by the sea. The former coast is now the British Isles. Britain, once a tropical land, is now a colder place, filled with a different kind of forest. New photon-powered trees, like towering pines and sturdy oaks. Trees with strong, thick trunks. Which is why they were cut down. Over the centuries, forests all across England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales are cut down and burned for fuel. When wood is heated, its atoms get agitated. The solid matter breaks down and the stored solar energy is released as fire. Medieval Britons don't know about photons, but they do know that if you want fire, you chop down trees. At the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, forests covered 15% of England. By the 18th century, almost half that forest is gone. But the trees aren't just disappearing to keep peasants warm in the winter. Trees are vital for war.
A lot of timber has been used, the mighty oak trees, for example, to construct the enormous British Navy. The British Navy was responsible for significant deforestation in Britain.
The largest warships each need 4,000 oaks. And between the end of the 16th century and the start of the 18th, Britain's fleet nearly triples in size.
So, because of cold weather and war, by the 18th century, the people of Britain are facing a real energy crisis. They have to find something else to heat their homes with, but what? As it turns out, it's right beneath their feet.
Remember the world's first forest? When it was crushed beneath the earth, the pressure heated it and transformed it.
You have sediments that pile on top, creating pressure. And this pressure created chemical reactions inside the decaying plants.
Those crushed and buried plants and trees turned into something new. And England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales are packed with the stuff. Something that looks like a rock, but isn't. Coal, a fossil of the first forest that can be used for energy. A fossil fuel, because like wood, it burns.
The key to the fact that we get our energy from fossil fuels goes back to photosynthesis.
From a deep time perspective, coal is not just the fossilized remains of ancient plants. It's a packet of solar energy, frozen in time. And because the atoms of coal are more tightly packed together than atoms are in wood, a pound of coal has at least twice the energy of a pound of wood. So at the beginning of the 18th century, the British realized they're standing on an ancient treasure trove of energy. Britain is so full of coal that early mines don't have to go that far down. In many cases, less than 100 feet down. The trouble is, there's more than coal underground. There's water. Underground aquifers constantly filled by rain or melted snow. With the stroke of a pickaxe, miners could set off a flood. getting this new energy source could be a deadly challenge. So that's where the story could have ended. British miners and mine owners could have given up. The Industrial Revolution might have happened somewhere else, or not at all. But then something amazing happened, and it happened in a kitchen. Look at this kettle. A lot of people in England do just that in the 17th and 18th centuries, as coffee and tea from faraway places make boiling water a familiar sight in countless homes. One of these homes is in the town of Dartmouth, where a man named Thomas Newcomen is said to have watched, over and over, the actions of his kettle on the fire. Inside the kettle, heat agitates the water molecules. They move apart as liquid changes to gas. The gas expands, but it's trapped inside the kettle. Struggling to escape the kettle, the gas moves the lid up and down. That's what Thomas Newcomen and others saw. Steam, something that isn't solid, can move solid objects.
It may have been something like that, boiling and steeping their own tea and coffee, that triggered the genius of these early Industrial Revolution inventors. We could trap the steam within some mechanism. We could use this to drive pumps to clear the water out.
Thomas Newcomen creates a steam pump that removes the underground water from the coal mines. This makes the mines safer, so the British can dig deeper for more coal. The more steam power you have, the more coal you can dig. And the more steam power you can make from coal. From 1700 to 1850, British coal production increases more than 18 times.
By the middle of the 18th century, another kettle-watching Brit, a Scot named James Watt, transforms the steam pump into a steam engine that can be adapted to many uses, like powering mills that grind grain or weave textiles.
It's hard to overstate what an advance this was in using energy from the sun to power human work. Once, the only way to get work done was through human muscles. Then as now, our muscles access solar energy through photosynthesis. We ate plants, or animals that fed on plants. In the agricultural revolution, we added animal muscle and increased our power. First, by about 4 times. And later, by breeding bigger draft animals up to 10 times. But steam power was the real game changer.
Steam was stronger than animals. James Watt advertised his first engines as being 10 times as powerful as the horse, which is where we get the term horsepower.
About a century after those early engines, the largest coal-powered steam turbine can increase human power 100,000 times. In the 18th and 19th centuries, work, production, and energy use make the leap into a new age. the textile industry is the first to be radically transformed. As steam-powered machines replace hand weaving. Between the mid-1700s and mid-1800s, English cotton processing increases more than 29,000 times, from 1,250 tons to 366 million tons. Other products also become industrialized, and Britain's mass-produced exports increase 500% in the first half of the 19th century.
Before this, people were often making their own clothing, were growing their own food and so on. But mass production technology inside huge, unhealthy factories becomes the norm. Your job is to stand in 2 square feet of space in front of a production line. You've lost all connection with the finished product. It's become this sort of mind-numbing, repetitive task that you do over and over again for 11, 12 hours a day, often under brutal conditions. This is the way the Industrial Revolution transformed work and, in a sense, enslaved people, made them captive now to this new model of manufacturing.
Replacing an old energy source, wood, with a new one, coal, has inadvertently unleashed a steam-powered revolution. From the perspective of deep time history, this is the harnessing of the physics of the universe to create a new way of powering our civilization. Triggering this pressure change takes the heat of a fire. And it turns out the Earth's ability to sustain fire may be a very rare gift indeed.
In order to create a fire, you have to have 2 ingredients. One is you have to have the basic fuel, that is, hydrocarbons that have energy stored in them. And you also have to have an oxidizer, like oxygen. And the combination of the 2 with a spark will cause a fire.
So, no oxygen, no fire. Look at Titan, a moon of Saturn with hundreds of square miles of methane lakes. Methane's flammable, but those lakes won't burn.
One, it's very cold. And second of all, there's no oxygen.
We live on the only planet we know of where we can use fire to, among other things, unleash the power of steam.
But steam power needs a strong material to keep it contained. And the forces of deep time have provided that material, an element that formed with our planet, part of the cosmic debris from a dead star. In fact, it's the debris that helped snuff out the star in the first place.
When you wonder, where did the elements of the universe come from? You have to realize that they came from stars. Stars are like ovens.
Nuclear-powered ovens that bake elements. The larger the oven, the more elements you get out of it.
Now, our sun is a rather small star. As a consequence, it is not hot enough to create the higher elements. Our sun can make helium and a few other light elements, but not much beyond that.
A larger star, say 8 or 10 times the mass of the sun, can bake up a lot of elements like sulfur, chlorine, calcium and others. But the more it bakes, the more lighter elements fuse into heavier ones, and the more of its fuel the star uses up.
The heavier an element is, the harder it is to cook.
Finally, like a fire of coal or wood, the star uses up all its fuel. And what's left at the core of the star?
The tremendous amount of iron.
For a star of this size, iron is the limit. the star collapses, creating a final surge of energy. The oven explodes. It's an event known as a supernova. Everything in it is scattered for millions of miles, until gravity starts collecting it and the remains of other exploded stars together, in a place like Earth, which is what happened 4.6 billion years ago.
Iron was part of the early planet as it formed. Much of our iron sank to the center of the Earth.
However, when the crust formed, the crust froze many of the elements in their position as they are today. So not all the iron settled to the center.
And that, plus impacts from iron-rich asteroids early in our planet's history, is why 5% of the Earth's crust is made up of this one metal.
Iron is stronger than copper, stronger than bronze, strong enough and heat-resistant enough to keep steam power under control.
Steam power controlled by iron made coal so valuable, so essential, that faster ways had to be found to move these frozen packets of ancient solar energy from the mines to the factories.
At first, horses were employed to drag carts of coal along rails, but that's not fast enough. So horses are switched out for steam engines.
And the railroad is born. Starting in the 1820s, trains are carrying every kind of product, as well as people, at speeds never before imagined. Consider this. In 2350 BC, Sargon of Akkad, history's first great conqueror, went to war at maybe 15 or 20 miles per hour. For 4,000 years, no one could go any faster. Not the Spanish conquistadors or any king or soldier. But by the late 1800s, many passenger trains are hurtling ahead at up to 100 miles per hour. Trains annihilate time and distance, so that economic centers hundreds of miles apart are only hours or days away. The age of discovery connected the world. The Industrial Revolution speeds up those connections and forges new ones.
The railroad was critically important to industrialization in a number of ways. They facilitate nation building, nation unification. They facilitate a trade and commerce in a way that was not possible before.
For better or worse, industrialization had transformed work and business. It was about to alter the face of war.
We see warfare on a scale not seen before with industrialization because we've got weapons that are far more efficient and far more murderous in a sense.
The future of war arrives in 1861.
The American Civil War has been called the first modern war. Hundreds of thousands of troops are handed mass-produced rifles and shipped to battlefields on coal-powered trains along more than 30,000 miles of iron rails. And along a branch of the Potomac River, a battle is fought that looks like science fiction.
In the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate capitals stand on outlets of the Chesapeake Bay. Control of these waterways is a matter of life and death for both sides. In 1862, the Confederate Navy salvages a sunken Union steamship, the Merrimack, and armors it from stem to stern with iron plates. She's one of only a handful of ironclad ships in the world. Coal powers the ironclad into battle. Invulnerable to cannon fire, the Merrimac destroys 2 Union ships and disables a 3rd in the waters of Hampton Roads. But on the morning of March 9th, 1862, as the Merrimac closes in for the kill, she's confronted by another coal-powered ironclad, the Monitor. Built by the Union in response to early news of the Merrimac, the Monitor is the most original vessel in the world at that time. As people from north and south watch on opposite banks, the 2 ironclads clash. After 4 hours, the Merrimac is driven off. It's a strategic victory for the Union. But that isn't what makes the world sit up and pay attention.
This is. 1 ironclad defeats 3 wooden warships in quick succession. But when 2 ironclads fight it out for 4 hours, there isn't a single fatality on either side.
The world understood that the wooden warship, after 3,000 years, was suddenly yesterday's news. No more floating forests. Iron and steel will rule the waves. And with metal navies, the industrialized nations conquer the world. In the age of discovery, Europeans conquered overseas countries for gold and silver. With the Industrial Revolution, there's even more incentive to colonize. In the 19th century, one of the reasons Belgium colonizes the Congo is for its coal, and France conquers Algeria in part for its iron.
There's no doubt that one of the great motivators of the age of imperialism, if we can call it that, is to acquire resources all around the world, and also to acquire captive markets to sell their manufactured products back to.
While the Industrial Revolution spurs wars of conquest around the globe, the second part of that revolution is about to begin on a country road in the United States. It involves a steam engine and a teenage boy who will come to represent the industrial age. This is young Henry Ford. And his story is a perfect example of the surprising connections between apparently unrelated events in history. Because he wouldn't be here in Michigan in 1876 if not for something that happened 300 years earlier in the mountains of Peru.
So the potato in South America gets exported to Europe in the 16th century. It's a good entry-level crop for poor farmers, which is why it gets established so effectively in Ireland.
But in the 1840s, blight devastates Ireland's potatoes. 2 million Irish starve, and another million flee for foreign shores. One poor Irish farmer, William Ford, ends up in Dearborn, Michigan, where in 1876, his 13-year-old son Henry first sees a steam engine moving on its own iron wheels. Henry Ford is inspired to someday build a moving machine of his own. But as Ford grows up, he realizes that his machine won't run on coal. Coal was beginning to seem old-fashioned and inefficient. Despite coal-powered steam engines being central to the Industrial Revolution, at least 80% of their energy was wasted. In coal-driven steam trains, as little as 5% of the power goes to the wheels.
For the sort of what we might call almost the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, a new sort of form of energy is required.
There was a new form of energy available. Like coal, it's something the planet had been building up since the time of the dinosaurs. But while coal is basically crushed plants, this resource is mostly what's left of small marine creatures like plankton called diatoms. Like plants, they store solar energy. And when trillions of dead diatoms are crushed and heated by millions of years of underground pressure, something new is created: petroleum.
And starting in the mid-1800s, a byproduct of petroleum, oil, gives the Industrial Revolution the energy boost it needs. Just as coal is more densely packed with energy than wood, so petroleum is more densely packed than coal. In fact, it has around 50% more energy per pound. Adding to its efficiency, it's more easily stored and can be transported through pipes instead of by train. With oil, a ship's boiler can be smaller, but the ship can go farther. And the oil product gasoline is the essential ingredient for a European invention that spreads around the world: the internal combustion engine. It takes 90 tons of crushed diatoms and other fossils to make 1 gallon of gasoline. Ford doesn't invent the internal combustion engine or the automobile. But his gasoline-powered cars will dominate the early 20th century and put an end to humanity's 3,000-year dependence on the horse for personal mobility. But the automobile would be almost useless without another material.
Another vital resource for the Industrial Revolution was the development of rubber.
Rubber is essentially a form of tree sap. And like so many useful molecules, it evolved as a nasty-tasting defense mechanism for plants against predators.
People eventually realized, particularly after it's vulcanized through this particular process, that it has tremendous applications to industry in various ways.
The internal combustion engine makes the automobile possible, as long as it can ride on rubber tires. Imagine going on a road trip with steel rims. Not a pleasant thought, is it? Even more important, rubber molecules block one of nature's most powerful forces: electricity. So rubber can be wrapped around wires and power cables. The industrial world becomes electrified, thanks to the molecule that evolved as a defense mechanism in plants.
By looking at things in a new way, by using natural resources that have been waiting under our feet for eons, like gifts wrapped up by deep time history, humans changed the world in 2 short centuries. Newcomen's first practical steam pump was built in 1712. Wind the clock forward to 1914, and what do we see?
A world where Henry Ford has transformed the 19th century factory floor into the 20th century assembly line. A new combination of human and mechanical energy that will soon increase Ford's output 10 times. Meanwhile, annual coal production has increased from 3 million tons to 300 million tons. And annual oil production has gone from nothing at all to close to 400 million barrels. And despite brutal working conditions and an increasingly polluted environment, by the beginning of the 20th century, life expectancy is rising in the industrialized world. The population of Europe triples since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. But this industrialized Europe is lurching towards a war, the likes of which the planet has never seen. A war that hinges on another product of the deep past. Nitrates. A key ingredient in gunpowder and explosives, often created by explosive blasts of lightning. Electrical discharges 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. And when lightning strikes, it creates a chemical reaction in the air.
Most of Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen molecules, N2. But lightning, which is an electrical discharge, separates the nitrogen molecules into the individual atoms. Nitrogen atoms love to combine with oxygen, and they form nitrates. The nitrates then get dissolved in the water droplets in the air. They come raining down. They get fixated into the soil. That then gets used by plants.
Amazingly, the same nitrates that can blow things up also fertilize the dirt where plants grow.
So in a sense, we owe our existence, because we eat plants, to lightning.
In the early 20th century, industrial nations seeking fertilizers and explosives looked to distant deserts, where ancient storms have left huge amounts of nitrate-rich deposits. Leaving behind this, caliche, the mineral with the planet's highest natural concentration of nitrates.
In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Germany's explosives industry depends on caliche from the Atacama Desert in Chile. The British Navy moves swiftly to blockade Chile, cutting off Germany's supplies. But Germany has an industrial-age solution. The Kaiser's army turns to science and a patriotic chemist named Fritz Haber, one of the most important individuals of the 20th century.
Haber had recently done something really extraordinary. He found a way to use nitrogen in the air and ammonia to create artificial nitrates, the basis for a century of synthetic fertilizers that revolutionized agriculture.
Applying industrial technology, including industrial fertilizers and so on, to increasing food productivity around the world to try and bring an end to poverty, or at least alleviate that somewhat.
Haber's goal is to feed the world. But the German High Command knows that his artificial nitrates can be used to kill people. Without artificial gunpowder, Germany might have had to surrender within months. Thanks to Haber, the war can go on for 4 years. This isn't Haber's only contribution to the war effort. He also uses his skills as a chemist to develop the defining weapon of the First World War. Poison gas. Haber sees no difference between killing with gas and killing with explosives. But his wife Clara, also a chemist, is horrified. Three weeks after the first use of poison gas in war, Clara Haber takes her own life. The next day, Fritz Haber leaves Germany to supervise the first use of poison gas against Russian troops on the Eastern Front. World War I becomes famous as the Poison Gas War. But this is also the war where gasoline plays a vital role in the engines of tanks, airplanes, troop transport vehicles, submarines, and zeppelins. In just half a century after the Civil War, weapons have become far more destructive and energy intensive. One artillery shell flies over no man's land with 1,000 times the energy of a bullet at Gettysburg. It's an industrial age war in every sense. Even the choice of battlefields. For example, the German army is determined to occupy and control the southern part of Flanders because it's the source of 80% of France's coal.
A lot of the strategic decisions that are being made during these wars are decisions to either acquire resources or cut off potential enemies from being able to acquire these resources.
17 million dead, soldiers and civilians. Maybe twice that number wounded, including my own grandfather. In a way, those deaths are as much a part of the Industrial Revolution as the First World War.
The idea of industrial progress survived the war, but just barely. Science and technology had been used by Fritz Haber and others to devastate a generation.
Soon, industrialized warfare would reach frightening new heights in the Second World War.
Planes and tanks rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers. There were new technologies from radar to rockets. Both sides used Ford's industrial practices to make weapons production as efficient as possible. Both sides use Haber's artificial nitrogen to make explosives. And another raw material created by deep time is turned into the ultimate weapon of war. Remember how supernovas create iron? The remnants of supernovas can create something even more amazing.
You start with a supernova. After the star explodes, what's left? The corpse.
The stellar corpses are called neutron stars. With the immense mass of a sun condensed into an object no bigger than Manhattan Island. And every now and then, in the depths of space, these superdense objects meet.
When two neutron stars collide, you get a tremendous explosion, which we call a gamma ray burst. And in this explosion, very heavy elements like uranium can be produced by nuclear reactions.
Like iron, uranium was part of the Earth as it formed, an element packed with 3 million times the energy of coal. President Truman called the weaponization of atomic energy a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. As for Fritz Haber, he died before the Second World War began, but his legacy lived on. Haber had helped develop a pesticide called Zyklon B, which was used after his death to murder millions of Jews, including some of Haber's relatives. And yet Haber's nitrogen formula, for which he shared the Nobel Prize, helped feed millions and then billions. At least 40% of the people alive today directly owe their lives to the food grown with artificial fertilizer. More than that, 80% of the nitrogen in the tissues and muscles of everyone on Earth today came from food grown with Haber's process. Haber's name isn't as well known as Henry Ford's, but his influence on humanity has been at least as great, for good and ill.
Their legacies and the legacy of the Industrial Revolution are still all around us. Think about this. Between the agricultural revolution more than 10,000 years ago and the eve of the Industrial Revolution, human numbers increased from 5 million to almost 1 billion. But per capita wealth, the wealth available to each human had barely increased at all. And then, an energy revolution. By the outbreak of World War I, per capita GDP had increased by 250%. And today, 7 billion humans, but with an average wealth per person that's 10 times that of the pre-industrial world. That's why they call it an industrial revolution, because it changed everything. You could say that the Industrial Revolution started when 18th century Europeans needed a new form of energy and found it in natural resources that had been there forever but could suddenly be used.
But the Industrial Revolution would have been impossible if not for the subatomic particles at the heart of the sun. The ancient forests that were turned into storehouses of solar energy. And the metal that helped kill a star and gave life to cars, ships, and buildings. Stages of the multi-billion-year assembly line of deep time history.